The Trojan War, between myth and history. The story of the Trojan War has been told for nearly 3,000 years, whispered first by poets and later written down as epic verse. For many people, it begins with gods and heroes, with Achilles, Hector, and a wooden horse. Yet behind the poetry lies a quieter and more uncertain question that still interests historians today. Did a real war inspire this legendary tale? The earliest and most influential account comes from Homer's Iliad, composed around the 8th century BCE. The poem does not tell the entire war, but instead focuses on a short, intense period near its end. According to the story, the conflict began when Paris, a prince of Troy, took Helen, the wife of the Spartan king Menelaus. In response, Greek kings united under Agamemnon and sailed across the Aegean Sea to besiege the city of Troy. For 10 long years, the armies fought beneath its walls. For centuries, many believed this story was pure myth. Gods openly intervened in battles, heroes possessed near superhuman strength, and events followed the rhythm of poetry rather than history. Yet myths often preserve fragments of real memory. In the late 19th century, the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann excavated a site called Hysteria in modern-day Turkey. There, he uncovered the remains of several ancient cities, built one atop another, spanning many centuries. One of these layers dated to around 1200 BCE, the same period traditionally associated with the Trojan War. This discovery did not prove Homer's story in full, but it suggested something important. A wealthy city once stood at a strategic crossroads between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Control of this location would have been valuable for trade, politics, and power. Conflicts over such a city would not have been unusual in the late Bronze Age, a time when kingdoms regularly fought over resources and influence. Modern scholars tend to agree on a careful middle ground. The Trojan War, as described by Homer, is not a historical record, but it may be based on one or more real conflicts. The names of heroes, the length of the war, and the famous Trojan horse are likely poetic creations. However, the idea of a prolonged struggle between Mycenaean Greek forces and a city in northwest Anatolia fits well with what we know of the era. The famous Trojan horse itself is especially uncertain. Some historians interpret it as a symbolic story, perhaps representing an earthquake, a siege engine, or a trick used during warfare. Others see it simply as a powerful metaphor created to explain how an unconquerable city finally fell. There is no archaeological evidence for a giant wooden horse, but that absence does not lessen the story's impact. What makes the Trojan War endure is not just the question of whether it happened, but what it reveals about human nature. The Iliad speaks of pride, rage, loyalty, and loss. It shows the cost of war not only in victories, but in grief, exhaustion, and broken families. Hector's farewell to his wife and child, Achilles' sorrow after killing his enemy, and the suffering of ordinary people trapped inside the city walls feel timeless. In this way, the Trojan War exists in 2 worlds at once. One is the world of archaeology and cautious historical reconstruction. The other is the world of memory, poetry, and meaning. Somewhere between myth and history, the story continues to live, not because we are certain it happened exactly as told, but because it captures truths about conflict that remain unchanged, even after thousands of years. The Fall of Constantinople. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople stood as one of the most remarkable cities in human history. Founded in 330 CE by the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, it was built to be a bridge between worlds, positioned between Europe and Asia, protected by the sea on three sides and by massive stone walls on land. The city became the heart of the Byzantine Empire and a guardian of ancient knowledge, law, and faith. By the middle of the 15th century, however, Constantinople was a shadow of its former power. The empire that once ruled the eastern Mediterranean had been reduced almost entirely to the city itself. Its population had declined, its treasury was weak, and its military forces were limited. Surrounding it was the expanding Ottoman Empire, young, organized, and confident. In 1453, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, only 21 years old, set his sights on the city. He understood that Constantinople was more than a fortress. It was a symbol of imperial authority and control over key trade routes. To take it would secure Ottoman dominance in the region and mark the beginning of a new era. The siege began in April. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI prepared for a defense he knew might not succeed. The famous Theodosian walls, which had protected Constantinople for centuries, still stood strong. Yet warfare was changing. Mehmed brought massive cannons, some of the largest ever used at the time. Day after day, they struck the ancient walls, weakening them slowly but steadily. The defenders relied not only on the walls, but also on the Golden Horn, a natural harbor protected by heavy chain stretched across its entrance. This barrier prevented enemy ships from entering, securing the city's northern side. For a time, it worked. Ottoman naval forces were unable to break through, and the Byzantines believed the harbor was safe. Mehmed responded with a bold and unexpected strategy. Rather than attacking the chain directly, he ordered part of his fleet to be moved over land. Using wooden logs greased with oil, Ottoman soldiers transported ships from the Bosphorus across the hills behind Galata and down into the Golden Horn. When the defenders awoke to see enemy ships floating where none should have been, it was a moment of shock and disbelief. This maneuver did not end the siege immediately, but it changed its balance. The city was now threatened from multiple sides. Defenders were forced to divide their already limited forces, and the psychological impact was immense. Constantinople no longer felt protected by its geography. As the weeks passed, exhaustion spread within the city. Food supplies dwindled, repairs became harder to manage, and hopes for outside help faded. On May 29, 1453, Ottoman forces launched a final assault. After hours of intense fighting, the defenses collapsed. Emperor Constantine XI is believed to have died in battle, choosing to fight alongside his soldiers rather than flee. With his death, the Byzantine Empire came to an end after more than 1,000 years. Mehmed II entered the city and declared it his new capital. Rather than destroying Constantinople, he preserved and transformed it. Churches were converted into mosques, new institutions were built, and the city began a new life under Ottoman rule, soon to be known as Istanbul. The fall of Constantinople reshaped the world beyond its walls. Scholars fled west, carrying ancient texts, helping ignite the Renaissance. Trade routes shifted, pushing European powers to seek new paths by sea. What seemed like an ending became a beginning. In the quiet perspective of history, Constantinople did not fall into silence. It changed hands, changed faiths, and changed names. But it remained what it had always been, a living city, standing between continents, reminding us that even the strongest walls cannot stop time itself. The Knights Templar, rise, power, and sudden fall. The story of the Knights Templar begins quietly in the aftermath of the First Crusade. In the early 12th century, Jerusalem had come under Christian control, but the roads leading to the city remained dangerous. Pilgrims traveling from Europe often faced robbery or death. In response, a small group of knights formed a brotherhood with a single purpose: to protect those travelers. Founded around 1119 CE, the Knights Templar combined two identities that rarely existed together. They were monks, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and they were warriors, trained for battle. They lived under strict religious discipline, yet carried swords and rode into combat. This unusual combination gave them both moral authority and military power. Over time, the Templars gained the support of kings, nobles, and the Catholic Church. Donations of land and wealth poured in. Because pilgrims needed a safe way to travel with money, the Templars developed an early financial system. A traveler could deposit funds in one Templar location and withdraw them in another. This made the order not only a military force, but also one of the most sophisticated economic networks in medieval Europe. At their height, the Templars owned vast properties across Europe and the Middle East. They answered only to the Pope, not to local rulers, which granted them independence, but also bred suspicion. As the Crusader states weakened and eventually fell, the original purpose of the order faded. Yet their wealth and influence remained. In 1307, everything changed. King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the Templars, moved against them. On Friday, October 13th, Templar members across France were arrested simultaneously. They were accused of heresy, blasphemy, and secret rituals. Under torture, some confessed, though many later withdrew their statements. Pope Clement V, under pressure from the French crown, eventually dissolved the order in 1312. The last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was executed in 1314. With his death, the Knights Templar vanished as an official institution. In the centuries that followed, legends filled the silence they left behind. Stories of hidden treasure, secret knowledge, and lost relics spread across Europe. While most of these tales have no historical evidence, they reflect something real: the shock of seeing a powerful institution disappear almost overnight. The true story of the Knights Templar is not one of mystery, but of power and fear. They rose because they served a need. They fell because their independence made them dangerous to kings. Their legacy reminds us that in history, survival often depends not on strength alone, but on who controls the story when power begins to shift. The Ottoman Empire, from a small tribe to a world power. The Ottoman Empire began not as a grand state, but as a small frontier principality on the edge of a collapsing world. In the late 13th century, Anatolia was divided among rival powers after the decline of the Seljuk Turks. Amid this uncertainty, a minor leader named Osman I ruled a modest territory near the Byzantine border. From his name, a dynasty would rise that would shape history for more than 6 centuries. Osman and his early successors expanded gradually, drawing strength from mobility, discipline, and a flexible approach to governance. They absorbed different peoples, religions, and traditions rather than erasing them. As the Ottomans grew, they developed a strong military structure, including the use of cavalry and, later, an elite infantry force known as the Janissaries, who were trained and paid directly by the state. In 1453, the capture of Constantinople transformed the Ottomans from a regional power into an empire. The city became the new capital, linking Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. From there, Ottoman influence spread rapidly. By the 16th century, under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire reached its height. Its borders stretched from Central Europe to North Africa and from the Arabian Peninsula to the gates of Vienna. What set the Ottoman Empire apart was not only conquest, but administration. The empire ruled over Muslims, Christians, and Jews through a system that allowed religious communities a degree of autonomy. Local customs were often respected, taxes were regulated, and law was shaped by a balance between Islamic principles and imperial authority. This approach brought long periods of stability to a vast and diverse population. The Ottomans were also patrons of art, architecture, and learning. Mosques, bridges, libraries, and public baths reshaped cities across the empire. Istanbul became a center of culture and trade, drawing merchants, scholars, and travelers from across the known world. The empire controlled key trade routes, benefiting from commerce between East and West. Over time, however, challenges grew. Military technology in Europe advanced, internal corruption weakened institutions, and reforms struggled to keep pace with a changing world. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the empire faced territorial losses and increasing pressure from foreign powers. Despite efforts to modernize, decline became difficult to stop. The Ottoman Empire officially ended after the First World War, when its remaining territories were occupied and divided by the victorious powers. Out of this collapse, a new state emerged under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who led the Turkish War of Independence against foreign occupation. In 1923, the Republic of Turkey was established, marking a decisive break from imperial rule and the birth of a modern nation-state. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk holds a unique and enduring place in the Turkish nation. He was not only the founder of the republic, but the architect of its transformation. Through deep reforms, he reshaped the political, legal, and social foundations of the country. The abolition of the Sultanate, the establishment of secular law, the expansion of education, and the promotion of science and reason were all central to his vision. Ataturk emphasized national sovereignty, independence, and the idea that a nation's strength comes from its people rather than inherited power. For many in Turkey, Ataturk represents renewal after collapse. He is seen as the leader who turned defeat into dignity and fragmentation into unity. His legacy is not only found in institutions and reforms, but in a shared sense of identity, shaped by resilience, self-determination, and belief in progress. The story of the Ottoman Empire is therefore not only one of rise and fall, but of transformation. From a small border tribe to a world empire, and finally to a modern republic, this long history reminds us that nations, like people, survive by adapting, learning, and choosing their future in moments of greatest challenge. The Witch Trials: Fear, Faith, and Mass Hysteria. The witch trials were not born from darkness alone, but from fear shaped by uncertainty. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, thousands of people across Europe and parts of North America were accused of practicing witchcraft. Most were ordinary individuals, living quiet lives, suddenly pulled into a storm of suspicion that few could escape once it began. At the heart of the witch trials was a world struggling to explain suffering. Crop failures, disease, infant mortality, and sudden death were common realities. Science had not yet provided answers, and religious belief shaped how people understood the unknown. When disaster struck, communities often searched for a human cause, someone to blame, someone believed to be in league with dark forces. Church teachings and legal systems played a powerful role. Although early Christianity did not focus heavily on witchcraft, beliefs shifted over time. By the late medieval period, the idea that witches formed secret pacts with the devil had taken hold. Manuals such as the Malleus Maleficarum, published in the late 15th century, described supposed signs of witchcraft and encouraged aggressive prosecution. These texts were treated as authority, despite lacking evidence by modern standards. Accusations often began quietly. A neighbor's illness, a failed harvest, or a personal dispute could turn into suspicion. Women were accused far more often than men, especially those who were poor, elderly, widowed, or socially isolated. In many cases, being different was enough. Once accused, the path toward innocence was narrow. Trials relied on confessions, many of which were extracted through torture or extreme psychological pressure. The legal procedures of the time allowed fear to replace proof. Rumors were accepted as testimony. Dreams and visions were treated as evidence. In some regions, simply being named by another accused person was enough to spread the panic further. Each confession fed the next accusation, creating waves of fear that moved from village to village. The witch trials reached different intensities across regions. In parts of Germany, Switzerland, and France, executions were widespread. In England, trials were fewer but still destructive. In colonial North America, the Salem witch trials of 1692 became the most famous example where mass hysteria led to executions based on spectral evidence and public panic. Within a year, the trials collapsed under their own weight, leaving lasting regret. By the early 18th century, attitudes began to change. Legal standards slowly improved, skepticism grew, and the Enlightenment encouraged reason over superstition. Courts became less willing to accept invisible crimes as proof, and the witch trials gradually came to an end. Today, the witch trials are remembered not as a struggle between good and evil, but as a warning. They show how fear can overpower justice, how authority can misuse belief, and how societies under stress can turn against their own. The accused were not witches in the mythical sense. They were victims of a time when uncertainty demanded answers, and fear was allowed to decide who deserved to suffer. In quiet reflection, the story of the witch trials reminds us that progress is not only measured by what we learn, but by what we choose not to fear anymore. The French Revolution. When the people rose. In the late 18th century, France was a kingdom marked by deep imbalance. Society was divided into rigid classes, where privilege was inherited and hardship was widespread. While the monarchy and nobility lived in comfort, much of the population struggled with rising bread prices, heavy taxation, and limited political voice. For years, these tensions quietly built beneath the surface. The French state itself was in crisis. Decades of costly wars and extravagant royal spending had left the treasury nearly empty. Attempts to reform the tax system failed, largely because the privileged classes resisted change. In 1789, King Louis XVI called the Estates General, an assembly that had not met in over a century, hoping to resolve the financial emergency. Instead, it opened the door to something far greater. Representatives of the common people, known as the Third Estate, soon realized that the existing system offered them little real power. Declaring themselves a national assembly, they claimed the right to represent the nation as a whole. This moment marked a shift in political thinking. Sovereignty, they argued, belonged not to the king, but to the people. On July 14th, 1789, fear and anger erupted in Paris. Crowds stormed the Bastille, a fortress prison that symbolized royal authority. Though it held few prisoners, its fall became a powerful image of resistance. Across France, similar uprisings followed. Feudal privileges were challenged, and long-standing traditions of hierarchy began to collapse. In the years that followed, the revolution moved through phases of hope and violence. New ideas flourished. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity as universal principles. Yet the struggle to protect the revolution from internal and external threats led to increasing radicalism. By 1793, France entered the period known as the Reign of Terror. Revolutionary leaders believed that harsh measures were necessary to defend the new republic. Thousands were executed by guillotine, including King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. Justice became swift and unforgiving, driven by fear of betrayal rather than careful judgment. Eventually, exhaustion set in. The revolution devoured many of its own leaders, and public support for extreme measures faded. Out of this instability rose a young general, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1799, he seized power, bringing the revolutionary era to a close while preserving many of its reforms. The French Revolution did not create a perfect society, but it permanently changed how people understood power and rights. Monarchies across Europe felt its shock waves. The idea that citizens could challenge authority, demand representation, and reshape their future became impossible to ignore. In quiet reflection, the French Revolution stands as both inspiration and warning. It shows how deeply people long for dignity and fairness, and how easily noble ideals can be overtaken by fear. Its legacy lives on not only in France, but wherever people continue to ask who should rule and in whose name power is truly held. The Cold War, a world living on the edge. After the Second World War ended in 1945, the world did not find peace. Instead, it entered a long period of tension known as the Cold War. Two superpowers emerged with very different visions of society. The United States promoted capitalism and democratic governance, while the Soviet Union supported communism and a centralized state. Their rivalry shaped global politics for nearly half a century. The Cold War was called cold because the two sides rarely fought each other directly. Instead, fear of nuclear weapons kept open war at bay. Both nations possessed arsenals capable of destroying entire cities within minutes. This balance of terror, known as mutually assured destruction, created a strange form of stability built on the constant threat of catastrophe. Conflict played out indirectly. Wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan became battlegrounds for influence rather than purely local struggles. Espionage replaced open combat, and intelligence agencies worked in secrecy, gathering information and spreading misinformation. Ordinary people lived under the shadow of decisions made far above them, often without knowing how close the world came to disaster. One of the most dangerous moments occurred in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just miles from the United States, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. For 13 tense days, diplomacy and restraint determined humanity's survival. The crisis ended peacefully, but it revealed how fragile global stability truly was. The Cold War also shaped daily life. In many countries, fear influenced education, media, and culture. Children practiced nuclear drills, artists responded to anxiety through music and film, and scientists raced to advance technology faster than their rivals. Space exploration became another arena of competition, turning scientific achievement into a symbol of national pride. By the late 1980s, the strain became unsustainable. Economic pressure, political reform, and public demand for change weakened the Soviet system. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, bringing the Cold War to an end without a final battle. The Cold War remains a reminder that peace can exist without safety, and that silence can be as tense as war. It shows how close humanity came to self-destruction, and how restraint, dialogue, and patience ultimately proved more powerful than weapons. The Age of Exploration. When the world expanded. For most of human history, the world felt vast and unknown. Oceans marked the edges of maps, and distant lands were filled with uncertainty. In the 15th century, this began to change. European kingdoms, driven by trade, ambition, and curiosity, entered a period now known as the Age of Exploration. Advances in navigation made long sea voyages possible. The magnetic compass, improved ship design, and more accurate maps allowed sailors to travel farther than ever before. Nations such as Portugal and Spain took the lead, seeking new routes to Asia in order to bypass long and costly land trade paths. Explorers like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus became symbols of this era. Da Gama reached India by sailing around Africa, opening a direct sea route between Europe and Asia. Columbus, attempting to reach Asia by sailing west, instead arrived in the Americas, unknowingly connecting two worlds that had been separate for thousands of years. These voyages transformed global history. Goods, ideas, plants, animals, and people began moving between continents in what later became known as the Columbian Exchange. New foods reshaped diets, while unfamiliar diseases devastated indigenous populations. Wealth flowed into Europe, but often at the cost of exploitation and suffering. Exploration was not driven by curiosity alone. Competition between empires led to conquest and colonization. Indigenous civilizations were overpowered by foreign armies, advanced weapons, and political manipulation. Entire societies were reshaped or destroyed as empires expanded their reach. At the same time, the world became more connected than ever before. Maps grew more accurate, knowledge of geography expanded, oceans once seen as barriers became pathways linking distant cultures. The Age of Exploration was an era of discovery and disruption. It brought progress and destruction, opportunity and injustice, wonder and loss. Its legacy still shapes the modern world, from global trade networks to cultural identities. In quiet reflection, this period reminds us that expanding knowledge often comes with responsibility. The world grew larger in human understanding, but history asks us to remember the cost at which that understanding came. Pirates of the Golden Age, myth, freedom, and the lawless sea. When people think of pirates, they often imagine hidden treasure, black flags, and fearless rebels sailing under the open sky. Yet behind the legends lies a real historical period known as the Golden Age of Piracy, roughly between the late 1600s and early 1700s. It was a short time, but its stories continue to fascinate people, especially the young, because they speak of freedom, danger, and life lived outside the rules. This era began as European empires expanded across the oceans. Trade routes between Europe, Africa, and the Americas grew busy with ships carrying gold, silver, spices, and goods. These ships were valuable, slow, and often poorly protected. For some sailors, piracy became an alternative to harsh naval life and unfair pay. Many pirates were not born criminals. Life aboard merchant and navy ships was brutal. Sailors faced long voyages, strict discipline, and little reward. Pirates offered something different. Crews often voted for their captains, shared loot more equally, and followed their own codes. In a world ruled by kings and empires, pirate ships became strange floating societies built on agreement rather than force. Famous figures emerged during this time. Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, used fear as a weapon, lighting slow-burning fuses in his beard to appear terrifying in battle. Anne Bonny and Mary Red challenged expectations by fighting alongside men disguising themselves as sailors. These individuals became legends, though their lives were often short and violent. Piracy was not heroic in reality. Attacks were sudden and brutal, and many victims suffered greatly. Governments responded with force, sending navies to hunt pirates down. Public executions were meant to serve as warnings, showing that freedom without law came at a heavy price. By the early 18th century, piracy declined. Trade routes became better protected, and former pirates were offered pardons or hunted relentlessly. The age of pirates ended, but their image did not. What remains is a powerful idea. Pirates represent rebellion against unfair systems, a desire for control over one's own life, and the risk of choosing freedom without limits. That is why their stories continue to attract new generations. In quiet reflection, the golden age of piracy reminds us that legends often grow from real struggles. Between myth and history, pirates still sail in our imagination, not as heroes or villains alone, but as symbols of choice, consequence, and the cost of living by one's own rules. Ancient Rome's gladiators, fame, blood, and survival. In ancient Rome, entertainment was not gentle. Among the loudest and most powerful spectacles were the gladiatorial games, events that filled massive arenas and drew crowds from every level of society. To modernize these contests seemed brutal and senseless. Yet to the Romans, gladiators were symbols of courage, endurance, and controlled violence, living at the edge between death and fame. Gladiators were not always slaves forced into combat. Many were prisoners of war or criminals, but some were volunteers. These men, known as auctorati, chose the gladiator's life in exchange for money, debt relief, or the chance at glory. Once enrolled, a gladiator belonged to a training school called a ludus, where life was strict, disciplined, and carefully controlled. Training was intense and methodical. Gladiators practiced for hours each day, learning specific fighting styles with defined weapons and armor. Some fought with swords and shields, others with nets and tridents, each style designed to create contrast and drama in the arena. Contrary to popular belief, gladiators were valuable investments. They were fed well, given medical care, and trained to fight skillfully rather than recklessly. The arena was a place of danger, but not constant death. Matches were often controlled, and not every fight ended with a fatal blow. When a gladiator was defeated, the decision of life or death could depend on the crowd or the sponsor of the games. Mercy was sometimes granted, especially to skilled or popular fighters. Victories brought rewards, money, and admiration. Some gladiators became celebrities. Their images sold on pottery and their names cheered across the city. Despite moments of fame, life as a gladiator was never truly free. Discipline was harsh, punishment severe, and survival uncertain. Even successful fighters lived under constant risk. Freedom could be earned through years of service, symbolized by the gift of a wooden sword. Few reached this point, but the possibility kept hope alive. The games themselves served a larger purpose. They reinforced Roman values of strength, control, and order. By watching violence within strict rules, society believed it maintained balance. Emperors used games to gain popularity, distract from political tension, and demonstrate power. The arena became a mirror of Roman life, where survival depended on performance, loyalty, and endurance. Over time, attitudes began to change. As the Roman Empire transformed and Christianity spread, public support for gladiatorial combat weakened. By the early 5th century, the games were officially banned. The arenas fell silent, but the stories did not disappear. Today, gladiators live on in imagination, often exaggerated as fearless warriors fighting only for death or glory. The reality was quieter and more human. They were individuals navigating a harsh system, seeking survival, dignity, and sometimes freedom in a world that offered few choices. In calm reflection, the gladiators remind us that even in the most violent systems, people search for meaning. Between applause and silence, victory and loss, they stood as living proof that survival itself can become a form of courage. If you enjoyed listening to these stories, and if they brought you a moment of calm, curiosity, or quiet reflection, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. It helps these stories reach more people who may be listening somewhere in the silence, just like you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for listening.